Thank you. I now call this regular meeting of the Board of Education to order at 7:07 p.m. We'll take a moment of silence to be followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'll have the coordinator call the roll.
Mr. Dixon?
Here.
Mr. Rollins?
Here.
Mr. Scrivano?
Here.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Here.
Mr. Siegel?
Here.
Mr. Connor? Mr. Escobedo?
Here.
With 6 present, 1 absent, we have a quorum.
Okay. Rod is not here, so Alan's taken care of, I'm sure, an expert job of the Channel 20 broadcast of our meeting. We don't have any staff recognitions or student recognitions tonight, so I will move right into petitions and communications portions of our meeting when we invite the public to make comments. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees the rights of citizens to petition their government as well as provides for freedom of speech. Also, the Illinois School Code requires that there be a time at regular and special meetings for public comment. Thus, we are following those mandates during this petitions and communications portions of our agenda. According to our Board Policy 2.230, the public comment portion of our meeting is limited to a total of 30 minutes. The Board will not respond to comments at this time. If it is appropriate, you'll be contacted in a timely manner by staff in response to your questions. We only have 2 speakers tonight, so I'll shorten this. It's not appropriate to address individual board members or individual administrators or discuss matters that would otherwise be confidential in such meetings. I would have both speakers come up to the front. There is a clock on the wall to help you with your 2 minutes. Thank you. So, Rod is doing what now? Oh, okay, there he is. Okay, Rod's here. Okay, all right, Rod. Okay, all right. Thank you for being here. And he's, as you know, a Jefferson grad, and he's volunteering his time to be here tonight with us. So, our first speaker tonight is Estelle Black, to be followed by Carol Jamber Smith. So, Estelle, is the microphone on? Sorry. Thank you.
To speak to you in regard to the naming of an elementary school in honor of Constance Vivian Lane. Mrs. Lane was employed by the Board of Education as a teacher, the first African-American teacher in the system, as a supervisor, as a consultant, and retired as assistant superintendent of elementary education. She was a stalwart individual in the community, not only in education, but in every way. I really commend the board for making this recommendation that an elementary school be named in her honor, so that all of the things that Connie did for the Rockford community and the children and the public schools will be remembered. Thank you very much.
So, Carol Jamber Smith, hello.
Good evening. Hello. Thank you for letting me speak for the 4th time in favor of this naming the school after Connie Lane. As I've said before, I cannot think of a more appropriate naming for a new school that is breathing new air and vitality into a neighborhood. We know that we heard people a long time ago in the naming committee who spoke about what that school means to their neighborhood. And Connie represents all the good of the public schools. She grew up in the public schools, and she returned to Rockford to have her entire career in the public schools. So thank you for Dr. Jarrett for this recommendation, and thank you very much for your consideration of this. And I promise you that there will be a party extraordinaire if this happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. Okay. Thank you. Are there any board member comments at this time? Mr. Dixon.
I would like to give thanks to Kishwaukee Elementary School. Last Friday, I had the opportunity to go to the Dr. Seuss Cafe where we read, and I really enjoyed the young people.
Great, thank you. Any other board member comments? If not, we'll move on then to our consent portion of our agenda, including the following consent items: payroll, accounts payable, purchase orders, contracts under 10,000, construction bid request log, and travel. The bid recommendations for the repointing of the brick at Brookview, Nashville, Guilford, and Flynn, and the Flynn HVAC lighting and ADA renovations. The recurring contracts for Windstream, the amendment to the services agreement, the AT&T local and long-distance telephone service, and the AT&T master service agreement. The STEAM Academy, other consent item was pulled by administration. 9B is still on, the Freedom of Information log. Is there a motion and a second to approve these consent items?
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Siegel, seconded by Mr. Dixon. Any items that board members wish to have pulled for separate consideration? Mrs. McCulloch.
8B and C.
8, B, and C? Okay.
We can just do it together.
Any others? Okay, I'll have the coordinator then call the roll on the approval of the items not pulled.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Rollins?
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano?
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Escobedo?
Yes.
The motion passes with 6 yeses, 1 absent.
Ms. McCulloch, we can do those together? All righty, so I'll take a motion to approve items 8, B, and C, the AT&T local and long-distance telephone service and master service agreement. Is there a motion for that?
So moved.
Mr. Siegel,
Second.
second by Mr. Dixon. Discussion. Ms. McCulloch.
So, and I didn't send a note ahead of time, and I apologize for that, but I've just been thinking about this today. And as we move into a more technologically driven organization, and we have, our administrators have cell phones, and we have cell phones, down here, yet we have hard lines in all the schools where this is for a recurring contract for long-distance services. I have a hard line at home for an emergency, but I'll tell you, I use my cell phone for all my long-distance calls because there's no reason for additional charges. So I wonder how we're looking at this, in the long term. I'm sure so my question is, what are we required to have? There must be some sort of safety piece about this from the state and the like. And then what are we looking at as we move forward? Will we always be bound to these kind of costs when we also have some additional communication devices in the buildings?
Sure. AT&T treats residential and business customers differently, so we will always have this cost regardless of the service. So we have moved most of our analog telephone lines to SIP digital service, but each of those calls still incurs a per minute charge as well as a long distance charge. So we will always have those usage fees, and there is a requirement for alarm panels, elevators, gas meters for us to maintain a certain number of analog telephone lines as well.
So just to review, maybe everybody else understood, but so every time a call is made on a hard line, it goes through a digital service, SIP digital, you said, and we pay per minute to AT&T, and then is there another charge for the digital component of that?
There is a charge for the line itself, and then depending on the distance of the call, AT&T does calling bands. So there is a certain per minute charge depending on where you're calling.
Any other questions or comments? Then have the coordinator call the roll on the approval of items 8, B, and C, the AT&T long-distance, local, and master service agreement.
Mr. Rollins?
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano?
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Escobedo?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
The motion passes with 6 yeses, 1 absent.
Thank you. We'll now move on to closed session consent items, including the following: the resolution authorizing dismissal of probationary teachers, the resolution authorizing dismissal of temporary and part-time teachers, the resolution authorizing reclassification of certified district administrators, and the HR organizational report and addendum. and as well as the closed session consent items, including the student discipline. Unless otherwise modified below, the board adopts and accepts the hearing officer's findings and recommendations in the following cases in which students expelled or suspended are prohibited from being on school grounds and school-sponsored activities without written prior approval from the principal. The expulsion of student 2029 is held in abeyance, contingent upon an EIA agreement for the remainder of this school year through the second trimester of next school year. Student 4163 is expelled for the remainder of this school year. Student 4159 is expelled for the remainder of this school year through the first semester of next school year. And students 4161, 4162, and 4164 are expelled for the remainder of this school year and all of next school year, as well as the student EIAs that were offered to these students: 1015, 3472, 3474, student 3475, 3476, 3477, 3479, 3480, 3482, 3484, 3485, 3486, student 3488, 3489, and 3490. Is there a motion and a second to approve these closed session consent items?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Siegel.
Second.
Second by Mr. Rollins. Are there any items that board members wish to have pulled for separate consideration? Seeing none, I'll have the coordinator then call the roll on the approval of the closed session consent items.
Mr. Scrivano?
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Escobedo?
Yes.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Rollins?
Yes.
The motion passes with 6 yeses, 1 absent.
Thank you. Our next item on the agenda is the superintendent's report. Dr. Jarrett.
Thank you, Mr. Scrivano. We had some encouraging news with a long bargaining process. The REA did ratify the contract, so we're looking forward to bringing that forward at the next meeting, and appreciative for all the hard work that's gone into that process. We are continuing to work to improve student achievement. I think we had a very robust education committee meeting. Ms. McCulloch will provide a full report where we talked about areas of improvement for our special education services, as well as 5 different textbook adoptions. So that was a very intense meeting. A lot of information was covered, and hope everyone will get the chance to learn more about some of the long-term direction we're going to ensure that all students have high-quality learning opportunities. And want to compliment all of our student athletes and fine arts representatives. I think we had a very strong winter season, and we're looking forward to transitioning into the spring season. So with that, I'll turn it back to Mr. Scrivano.
Okay. We'll move on to committee reports. Mrs. McCulloch, Education Committee.
So Education Committee met in this boardroom last night for 3 hours. So there's no way I want to share all of that with you, because I know that the reason we have committees is so that we don't have to have 5-hour board meetings. But I will say that the PowerPoints that we were giving, and if anybody wants to look those up, and if you go onto Board Docs, you go up in the corner where it says Main Governing Body and click on that area, you'll get to Education Committee, and then you'll get to the agenda and the links to these documents. But they give a full picture of what's going on. So the first one we heard about was special education, and we have a new executive director of special education who's been on the job for 8 months, and really taking a hard look at how we're delivering our services. And did a really nice compilation of state performance indicators, and that is also a link on that website. But what was interesting, one of the interesting pieces that she brought forward was a reorganization of the administration that's going to happen next year. Currently, we have 29 administrators working as special ed supervisors, downtown in all different contexts, and that is being reduced to 16. They are moving into, Heidi, you might have to help me with this. What are the ones in the buildings going to be called?
Program?
No.
They'll be called procedural coaches.
I see, I had the PR.
Okay.
Procedural. So instead of having a special ed supervisor in every building, we'll have actually certified staff that are working in the building with procedural components. This has, changed. Obviously, we'll have change in staff, but we'll also have a change in the way that we're going to be looking at special education and how we're providing it across the district. One of the areas that was, I guess it shouldn't have been a surprise. By the way, we serve 4,244 students with IEPs in this district. That's roughly 14% of our students, and that is right on track with the state. Which is one of the interesting pieces about the state plan indicators, is that they show you not only where we are with our district data, but where what the state target is and whether or not we've met those targets. So we have 4,000 students, it's about 14% of our population who have IEPs, and it's interesting that more secondary students, so our middle school and high school students, we have more secondary students who are in self-contained classrooms than at the elementary level, and especially at preschool, that we have fewer separate K through 2 special ed classrooms. So we start out with this inclusive model where our special ed students with IEPs are in the classroom with other students, and as they work their way up, as they are older and higher grade levels, we have right now a situation where we have more of our secondary students in those. And so I think one of the goals is to try to move those students out into classrooms as much as possible, and that maybe we're not offering them an opportunity to meet their potential because of the parameters that we've set in the environment at this point in time. We're not doing great with a lot of the numbers, but I hesitate because I think that part of this is in our IEPs, our students with special ed, and when we do the testing, and this is all based on the state test. It's not based on our growth model that we're looking at with MAPS and consistency. So basically, it's a snapshot once a year. How do they compare to the rest of the state? And so one of the questions is are our students able to take the assessments and perform as well as they can with the accommodations that they need? We're not so sure that we're doing as well in the test, in part because of that. I mean, there's other reasons. So the graduation rate for students with IEPs, I'm just going to give you a couple of numbers. So for the district, and this is 2016-17, is at 52.5%. The state target for students with IEPs, special ed students, is 84%, which, as you know, and we're not even there with our regular ed students, so we've got some work to do. The dropout rate for students with IEPs in 2016-17 was 8.5%, and it's a 4.7% target rate, so we're almost double on that. We are doing really well with reading assessment participation. Our students we're taking the tests, 98%. For math, are taking them. The state goal was 95%. For reading, we're at 98.3%. The state goal was at 95%. So, but there's a lot of areas that we have work to do. And so the reading assessments, students with IEPs meeting or exceeding standards in the state reading assessments was 3.5%. The state target is 42%. And I'll just give you one more. Students with IEPs meeting or exceeding standards on math, currently 2.3%, and the state target is 40%. So those are that's the kind of information that is in this, and we're really looking forward to next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, to see now that they've disaggregated this kind of data for us to look at numbers, metrics like this. That's what we want to see in the growth for our students. The other things in the executive summary, it talks about the staffing levels, it talks about special staff that are employed to work with these students, so I would highly suggest, especially for the board members who are interested in reading that, and I'd like to applaud the special ed department because they've really taken on a behemoth task of bringing all this information together, and it's a starting point for us to look at that. The other piece, and I'm not sure, board members, if you'd rather hear about this week or next week, because the adoptions are going to come through. They'll be on the agenda for next week. But this was this way when it comes, I guess, in your packet and you read through it, you'll kind of had a precursor and then you might be better prepared when it comes to us. But basically, resource adoption, we no longer call it textbook adoption because we're not just buying textbooks anymore. There's a lot of other pieces with software and the like. So the resource adoption, if you remember in a previous report that I gave, the district brought the curriculum leadership teams in on certain areas. We have a timeline, but certain areas being the integrated math and the global studies. I don't know if you remember those for high school, 2 new classes that we're doing. But what we did is our curriculum teams came up with a curriculum and then they went out and looked for resources to support that instead of us buying a book and fashioning our whole curriculum around that. So the process, the way it ran, it was about 2016, so 2 years ago they started writing the curriculums, and the CLTs, the curriculum leadership teams, and the task force came up with these curriculum. They were aligned to standards, to new curriculum philosophy, to essential outcomes, and what happened was the deans of those areas then reviewed materials, narrowed it down, the curriculum leadership team and task force, who are teachers, because we have to have, and we want to have teachers who are part of the process and who can go out and talk to the other teachers in their buildings. They reviewed those recommendations and met with vendors, and they used a rubric, and then they made the following recommendations. So we are going to be looking at a recommendation for the K-5 integrated literacy curriculum, and that book, or that curriculum or resource material is Defined STEM and NSTA Picture Perfect Science. And a third group was Follett Paired Text, and this is kind of interesting because Follett is going out and searching for resources to support, but they don't have, they did not bring forward to us, and I said this last night and I'll say it again, they did not bring forward to us what they were going to recommend or what we were going to buy. They just said that we have budgeted $500,000 for this, and they'll be bringing forth their recommendations because we don't have that information at this time. So that budget is $1,094,806 basically for about 12,000 students, which comes out to $91.23 per student. It would be in here by June 30th, and as we all know, professional development and how we get the curriculum, how we get the teachers familiar with the resources so that they can better utilize them in the classroom is really important, and we often have a problem getting teachers in for that training during the summer because, well, first of all, I don't know, we don't have dates yet, but it's just a challenge. And so we may end up starting the school year with some of this without everybody trained, but at least if someone in every building is trained, we can have the trainer and they can share that with the other teachers. ESL brought forward a recommendation for integrated literacy, and this would be for our bilingual students, the primarily Hispanic and Arabic, right? And is it like 130 Arabic and pretty much the bulk of that was Hispanic, and we're talking about 825 students. Their recommendation was National Geographic Reach. In the PowerPoint goes through, you can see some of the books and some of the pieces, but there's 26 elementary buildings that these will be going into. These would arrive by May. They'd get a half a day of training before the end of the year, plus 2 in the summer if possible. The cost of these was $431,742, and this was for 825 students, so that's $525 per student. And all those students will also have available to them the integrated literacy curriculum that I spoke of for the rest of the K-5 group, so that they would have both. And there was a great model about scaffolding and how these resources will help put them at the same level of their peers as they study. It is Title III funds, because I asked about the money piece, and it's Title III funds. And quite honestly, this isn't where we went out and looked at what was cheapest, right? We looked at what was right for providing for the students. But I think it's fair to say that some of this ends up being fairly costly. And part of this could indeed also be there's 825 students versus we're buying 12,000 of the other. So that's the K through 5 piece. The integrated math piece, the book, and if you remember that we're putting together, this is for freshmen, and there's about 30 teachers. It's called Core Connections, Integrated 1. It should be in by June. They're very generous because they give us 4 days of professional development to start and then 4 additional days during the year. They're happy to come into the classroom. It's $248,000. Global Studies, World Cultures and Geography, they only give us 2 days of professional development. And they explain to us that that's not as big a change as the change that we're making in math, and so we really need that support in the math piece. And that's $310,000. I was asked to make a comparison. If you remember, we approved Reading Horizons last year, and that was for K through 2. And that was $980,000, and that's about 6,000 students. We figure about 2,000 per grade level, right? So that was $163 per student. So just kind of give you some numbers. In the past, I haven't thought about it that way, but it's interesting how it pans out. Mr. Escobedo was very good at asking what kind of metrics they're going to be looking at to see if these are successful, and I don't know that. Did you feel like you got a really good representation? I mean, that also is in their PowerPoints in general, but you're looking at map assessments, but it's more than a resource, right? It's the teacher, it's the student, it's the environment, it's the support, and the resource is just part of that. So it's pretty hard to differentiate out other than the teacher's feedback on if there's any areas that they need help. We talked a little bit about IT and technology and how much support we'll need and how we're moving toward a one-to-one, right, device throughout the district so that all students can, and places have better than that. You did say that last night. But most of these have a component that is online for the students to use in the classroom, and so we want to make sure that if anybody who didn't have access to a computer at home, and we were told that pretty much anything that they would not have access to, the teachers can print off and send home with them. And they can have a hard copy version of, whatever the lesson is for the day. Some of these went out, now I didn't write this down, some of them went out like 6 years, and some of them were like 3 years in terms of longevity and support. So, but all I can say is the process was followed for the recommendations. People who knew better than I have decided that these are the right resources that our district needs. I think all the questions were well answered at committee. Please take opportunity to look through that so that you're prepared. We don't vote on it next week, but it'll be presented. We'll vote on it in April, and it's just important to get this in the works because already June 30th, is pushing us out and narrowing our window for training the staff. Thank you for my very long report.
Mr. Escobedo.
But it was a lot less than 3 hours.
There you go.
By the way, we meet again on April 17th, and I think Mr. Escobedo has something to say.
Sure. No, I was just going to address your question. I think, we talked about metrics and how do we gauge that this resource is, 3 years from now that it worked, that it panned off the way we expected it to. But I understand that, there's a lot of intricacies, and it's very hard to put some very hard metrics on some of this. But I think the point was to get administration thinking in those terms, and I think they've came out with some thoughts as well.
And when you present, thank you, Mr. Escobedo, when you present this next week, will Follett actually have listed the resource packets that they're putting together, or will we just be voting on that as a budget item, the $500,000?
Follett may be a board meeting behind because we have this tight turnaround with the 2 meetings back to back.
Okay.
And I'm doubtful that we'll make it to the March 20th. It will likely be the meeting after.
Okay.
So they're working to align the text titles with our essential learning outcomes, and that work takes time.
Are there any other board members?
I do have one more quick comment.
Sure.
So, Ms. McCulloch, I know that you seem to have some concern about the price per student and some per cost per student on some of this resources. I guess what I was going to say is, I guess, as we work with administration to have better plans to close the gap, and, it is what it is. It's going to take what it's going to take, and if it takes better resources, and we need to do whatever we need to do to make sure that every student in our district succeeds. And measuring, what it costs to get, certain resources per student. Every student has different opportunities for learning, and those require different resources. That's my take on it.
And I absolutely, I just think it's fair to look at numbers and to say how much we're investing, and that we are committed to closing that gap, and to do that is going to cost money. So I appreciate that, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to comment to Ms. Stettman that the big picture goal is that we have an aligned curriculum, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and that you have to commit resources to get there. But one of the things that I heard some of the deans talking about that kind of addressed Mr. Escobedo's questions were included things like they would be doing an annual curriculum audit.
Correct.
That Mrs. McCulloch mentioned the importance of the effectiveness of the teaching that goes along with the resources, so that's critical that we have the proper professional development time for the teachers that are going to use these new resources so that they can be effective in the delivery of that aligned curriculum.
Absolutely. Our work to this point has been really in guaranteeing a horizontally and vertically aligned curriculum that's focused around what our students need to be high capacity 21st century students and eventually citizens, which is that integration around content. And when we think about our approach to integration in the classroom, essentially what we've done is we've taken 4 separate resource adoptions and put them into one for integrated literacy, so that we have one program across the instructional day that brings in science, social studies, literacy, and health, so that students are getting that well-rounded experience. Our work now that we have the right design in place and we've identified the correct tools is to support teachers along the way of implementation, because it does require a shift. And so that's where we'll start pouring our resources next, is in that support.
Thank you. Mr. Rollins, the Finance Committee report.
Finance Committee has not met since our last board meeting. We will be meeting in this room on March 19th at 5:30 to continue our work on developing the budget.
Thank you. Mr. Connor is not here tonight. He's excused, so he'll be doing his Operations Committee report at our next board meeting, which is actually next Tuesday because of spring break. So we'll move on then to the action items for tonight, and our first action item is the naming and renaming of our facilities. And this is the recommendation from our administration and our superintendent is that school number 2, serving our Nelson and Kishwaukee elementary schools, be named the Constance Lane Elementary School. I will take a motion and a second for that.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Siegel.
Second.
Second by Mr. Dixon. Any questions or discussion? Mr. Rollins.
I'll support it because I think that there's been a lot of comments from the community that say why it's important that we name a school for Ms. Lane, but I do have a comment and a suggestion. The comment is that we have heard a lot of wonderful stories, but 30 years from now, there's not going to be anybody around who's going to remember those stories. I have no idea who McIntosh is. I have no idea who Conklin is. I have no idea. I think Bloom might have been a former superintendent. I think Welsh might have been a former superintendent. So here's my suggestion, which is out of our $17 million budget for that school, why don't we set aside a little bit of money to create some sort of presentation or memorial or display in the school itself, and even take the time to maybe collect some of these stories. And I'll go further and say maybe involve the students and staff that are going to be in that school to help us design something so that 30 years from now, when the people who were actually involved with Ms. Lane are gone, people will have, because there's not going to be a book that somebody can check out of a library that can tell them about Ms. Lane, so that 30 years from now, students and staff and parents can know and appreciate who Ms. Lane was and why she had a school named after her.
Great suggestion. Mr. Siegel.
I thought the name of Constance Lane reflected a great deal of imagination in naming a school. Jane Addams was a great name and a wonderful suggestion. King was a great name, not great enough to actually circulate the petition. But the Constance Lane name really showed a lot of imagination. We went out and we found a local graduate of Rockford Public Schools who turned out to be a real rock star on many, many levels. I think it would be fascinating to not only, do some research and find out and memorialize more about Ms. Lane, but to find more of these rock stars that I'm certain have come out of the Rockford Public Schools. I'm sure they are there. Will they all end up on school buildings? I don't know, but it might be a great exercise in examining the legacy of Rockford Public Schools. When this whole process started, I had never heard of Ms. Lane. And when the suggestion was made, I started talking to people. And magically, I seemed to talk to only people who knew her. And they magically spoke only in the most overarchingly glowing terms. As great as that is, I'm confident that there are more people like that. And I think it'd be really great if we could find them and celebrate them as well.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, go.
Mr. Dixon.
As everybody knows, that I wanted one of the newer schools to be Martin Luther King. But when I heard of Constance Lane and everybody, the conversations that I had, I was more than willing to let her name be on one of the newer buildings, and we'll look for somewhere else for Martin Luther King.
Thank you. Mr. Escobedo.
Yeah, so as Mr. Rawling was speaking, maybe the book itself could be done by our schools, an history of Miss Constance Lane. That book could be written by our schools and kept within our schools. But where my comment was going to go is, there was some of us that, would have liked to see that school, or it would have been nice for a lot of people in the community to have Dr. Martin King Jr. be honored. But the second thought is, if you think about the work of Dr. Martin Luther King and what Ms. Lane represents and the work that Dr. King did, that's being honored and reflected. So it worked out pretty well.
Thank you. Any other comments? Now I'll have the coordinator then call the roll on the approval of action item 15A, the naming of the school number 2 as Constance Lane Elementary.
Mrs. McCulloch,
Absolutely.
Mr. Siegel,
Enthusiastically, yes.
Okay.
Mr. Escobedo,
Yes.
Mr. Dixon,
Yes.
Mr. Rollins.
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano.
Absolutely yes.
The motion passes with 6 yeses, 1 absent.
Thank you. All right. Our second action item tonight is the TransFinder system that was presented by Mr. Slice from the Transportation Department. Is there a motion and a second to approve this item?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Siegel,
Second.
second by Mr. Dixon. Any questions or discussion? Seeing none, I'll have the coordinator then call the roll on the approval of the TransFinder system.
Mr. Siegel,
Yes.
Mr. Escobedo,
Yes.
Mr. Dixon, I'm sorry,
Yes.
I was carried away there. Mr. Rollins.
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano.
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch.
Yes.
The motion passes with 6 yeses, 1 absent.
Okay, our next action item is the Unite private network that Mr. Hull from our tech services presented. Is there a motion and a second to approve this item?
So moved.
By Mr. Siegel,
Second.
second by Mr. Dixon. Any questions or discussion? Seeing none out of the corner, then call the roll on the approval of the Unite private network.
Mr. Escobedo,
Yes.
Mr. Dixon,
Yes.
Mr. Rollins,
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano,
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch,
Yes.
Mr. Siegel.
Yes.
The motion passes with 6 yeses, 1 absent.
Okay, we are now on to new business, and Dr. Wolf is working his way up towards the front and will present the contract with Newzella online subscription service.
Thank you. We are asking for your approval next week on this. The Kennedy Middle School School Improvement Team, as part of their 5-year school improvement grant work, is asking for permission to spend SIG grant dollars on this. It's an online service with online training for teachers that would bring current high-interest literacy resources across curricular areas to the classroom, and teachers would use it in cooperation with their librarian. It's a total of $8,300 is coming to you because Conklin had purchased $1,900 of services, and so that pushes us over the $10,000 line for a roll call vote with the Board of Ed.
Will there be other schools investing in this as well?
There are other schools investigating it, looking at how it might fit into their curriculum. Right now, I do not have any that would go for the balance of this school year.
So is one year term?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So moved.
Second.
Microphone wasn't on. We are adjourned at 7:49.